Republicans are experiencing historically high levels of early voting, with roughly 60 million ballots cast, more than a third of the total predicted vote. Should the Harris campaign be worried, even though Democrats have begun to steadily recover? As of this writing, 41% of votes have been cast by registered Democrats, 40% by Republicans, and 19% by independents or third-party voters, according to NBC News' useful early voting tracking tool. This demonstrates that there is far less partisanship in early and absentee voting compared to 2020. This election cycle represents a significant change from 2020 in that Trump and the Republican Party actively promote early voting. People with a high propensity to vote who are very involved and cast ballots regularly have a significant role in this. These people are showing a clear Republican lean for the first time in recent memory, and it's possible that Republicans will end up with more votes than Democrats for the first time in the majority of our lifetimes. Because of this dynamic, Trump may be able to sustain a tiny loss of the independent vote while still maintaining a respectable lead in the national popular vote and the critical contest for 270 electoral votes. Having said that, let's examine the Electoral College map by looking at early vote data, polling, and demographic patterns to see where we are. I will not go into every safe state for each contender since I want to keep things moving. According to preliminary vote tallies, Republicans are anticipated to have a commanding lead in the following states: Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, and Alaska, which were formerly held by former President Trump. The Great Plains are home to the following states: North and South Dakota, Nebraska at the state level, Kansas in the 1st and 3rd districts, and Oklahoma. Appalachia is home to West Virginia, Kentucky, and Indiana, while the South is represented by historically Republican states like Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and South Carolina. Not only did these states vote overwhelmingly for Trump in 2020, they haven't cast a blue ballot since 2008. Republicans are currently winning by large percentages of 15 to 40 points in all of these states, according to early voting results. They have 125 electoral votes between them. When it comes to Kamala Harris, the Democrats have a commanding early advantage in a number of traditionally blue states. Hawaii, Oregon, California, and Washington make up the Pacific Coast. Only two non-coastal states, Illinois and Colorado, are reliably blue as you head east. Joe Biden won all of these states by a minimum of 15 points in 2020. Furthermore, these states have not voted for a Republican in nearly 40 years. The remaining Democratic strongholds are located in the Northeast, New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. Once again, it's hardly surprising that Democrats are soaring to enormous leads in the early voting here. All, Kamala Harris now has 190 electoral votes thanks to these states, while 17 remain on the fence. Neither candidate has a real chance of winning the majority of these remaining states. Both Iowa and Ohio, states that Trump won by 8 points in 2016 and 2020, are likely to remain in his grasp. The 2nd Congressional District of Maine, which is among the most rural, oldest, and mostly white in the nation, and could perhaps lean even farther to the right this cycle, is also one that he should hold on to. When it comes to New Mexico, Kamala Harris should have no problem winning. Notably, with a Biden support of 11 points compared to 13.5 in nearby Colorado, the 2020 campaign represented the first instance since 1968 in which New Mexico voted farther to the right than its neighbor to the south. Since New Mexico is the nation's most Hispanic state, and Colorado is one of the states heading to the left at the fastest rate, I predict that they will continue to differ this cycle. It is anticipated that the Hispanic vote would maintain its general trend toward the right in this cycle. For the time being, though, I'm classifying New Mexico as a likely blue state. In Maine, Harris is also very popular. In contrast to the solid 1st District, the statewide race is probably going blue. In 2020, Biden won Maine by 9 points, and in 2024 she appears to be winning by at least as much. There are now just 12 states left, with a combined electoral vote value of 191. These are the areas where voters will most certainly cast their ballots. More people are paying attention to Nevada's early vote totals than any other state's totals so far this election year. Normally, we would be talking about the Democratic firewall and whether or not Republicans could make up ground on Election Day by now. Still, Republicans had a 4-point lead over Democrats, with 39% of ballots returned being Republican and 35% being Democratic, out of a total of over 850,000 ballots cast, or around 60% of the overall turnout in 2020. This disparity is the most worrisome trend for Harris's campaign thus far, albeit it has shrunk somewhat in the past few days. Biden was able to secure a 2.4% victory in Nevada in 2020, thanks to the state's final early vote tally, which showed a 4-point Democratic advantage and totaled 1.3 million ballots. On the other hand, compared to national patterns, Nevada has been steadily moving toward the Republican Party. Even though Biden won the national popular vote by a larger margin in 2020, he maintained a 2.4% lead in Nevada, much like Hillary Clinton did in 2016. The Republican Party took advantage of this trend in 2022 and won the governor's mansion. According to the most recent polls, Harris is ahead of Trump by the slimmest of margins, just 0.1%. The 538-item poll average indicates that with the election so tight, Democrats will have to cross their fingers that the Republicans may lose ground in the early voting lead they have over the Republicans in the coming week. Unless he does this, Trump may be well positioned to win in Nevada and other battlegrounds as well. The state of Nevada is now leaning Republican, with Trump having a slim lead. Next stop, Arizona, for yet another Southwest race with intense competition. In 2020, Biden was narrowly defeated in Arizona, the second closest state by a hair. Maricopa County, which includes the Phoenix metro region, has been rapidly growing and becoming more diverse, which contributed to his victory. A small margin of victory for Democrats was achieved in the county and the state as a whole due to the high voting participation rates among Hispanics and voters with college degrees. Among the 1.7 million ballots cast early in person and by mail-in, Republicans presently have 42% of the vote compared to 34% for Democrats, indicating that Republicans are poised for another good showing. Since our last report, the pro-Republican lean has grown by 2 points. When looking at the 2.8 million early ballots that were returned in the 2020 election, Republicans were ahead of Democrats by 5 points, compared to a 3-point lead in 2020. Considering Biden's razor-thin 0.3% margin of victory in 2020, this change is noteworthy. The Democratic Party could lose Arizona if they make even a small mistake. Supporting this pattern is polling data, which shows that Trump has a 2.2% lead over Harris in the 538 average. Since Biden's withdrawal, Trump has maintained even or higher polling numbers than Harris in Arizona, the one key battleground state where he was previously trailing. However, returning to our map, Arizona will be tilted toward the Republican side. It is projected that Trump will win both states, barring a significant increase in the Democratic Party's early voting participation. Texas completes the southwestern quadrant and is the second largest electoral reward on the map, with 40 votes. As of the end of the first week of early voting, Texas had the highest number of ballots cast, with over 7 million. With 51% of registered Republicans and 37% of Democrats casting ballots, the Republican lead has shrunk to just 14 points, but it remains substantial. Reflecting on 2020 once more, the Republican victory in Texas that year was Trump's by a razor-thin margin of 5.6%. Over 9.5 million people cast ballots early or absentee, and the Republican Party had a 17-point advantage. With around 2/3 of the vote cast, the Democrats are, if anything, doing better than expected. At this moment in time, Trump leads Harris by almost 7 points in the running average of the polls, suggesting that he will exceed his 2020 advantage. The Democratic Party may have reached a ceiling in Texas in 2020 and will have a hard time improving upon that result this cycle because to the continued Republican trend among Hispanic voters. Therefore, we will classify Texas as leaning Republican based on these criteria. Florida is located in the southeastern United States, and it is one of several states where over 6 million ballots have been returned in the first few days of early voting. With 44% of the vote to 34% for the Democrats, Republicans have a commanding advantage of 10 points in this race. Even though Trump won Florida by 3.5 points in 2020, Democrats ended up with more than 9 million ballots cast, giving them a 1-point lead in the final early tally. This is another worrying indication for Kamala Harris. Since 2020, Republicans in Florida have registered much more voters than Democrats, causing the former to struggle in recent years. Since then, Florida has also seen a dramatic rightward shift, most notably in 2022 during the localized red wave, when Senator Marco Rubio and Governor Ron DeSantis were re-elected with enormous margins of victory, each by more than 15 points. Trump might secure Florida for the GOP in 2024 with the largest margin of victory in the Sunshine State in decades, according to polls. Our map now shows Florida and Texas as leaning Republican due to these patterns. Joe Biden won Georgia by a razor-thin margin of 0.2% in 2020, turning the peach state blue for the first time in 30 years. The following state is Georgia, which was the closest race that year. High voter turnout among black voters tilted the state ever so slightly in favor of Biden, and the fast expansion and diversity of Atlanta were major factors in his victory here. There may be racial depolarization this cycle, as more and more black and Hispanic voters are leaning toward Trump. In Georgia, where Democrats depend on high turnout and big majorities among black voters, recent polling crosstabs from mid-October to the end of the month show Trump up by more than 20 points among black voters compared to 2020. This might present a significant challenge for the party. With almost 3.5 million ballots cast in person or by mail, Republicans are currently leading by 3 points, 48% to 45%, and early voting in Georgia is also breaking records. Although the margin has shrunk somewhat, it should be remembered that out of 4 million ballots cast early in 2020, Republicans managed to outnumber Democrats by 8 points. Even while the Democratic tally may be skewed because of the initial flood of Democratic-leaning mail-in ballots, Harris's campaign is seeing Georgia as a key early voting battleground. Even though we'll be keeping a careful eye on these data over the next week, Georgia is still leaning Republican on our map for the time being. North Carolina is the next stop on the path up the southeast coast. Democrats will need to establish a strong early voting lead here to prevent Trump from easily winning the election in rural, Republican-dominated counties. Among the 3.3 million ballots cast so far, Republicans have a 1-point lead over Democrats, who are once again underperforming. In 2020, with almost 4.5 million votes cast, Democrats had a 5-point lead over Republicans going into Election Day. Nonetheless, Trump ended up winning the state by more than a point. Democrats are, once again, failing to meet their 2020 expectations in a state where a large turnout is crucial to their chances of winning. With North Carolina joining other Sunbelt states in the Republican tilt category on our map, Trump currently has a 1.1% lead against Harris in the 538 average. With 6 states remaining, Trump's electoral vote total rises to 268, just short of the crucial threshold. Let's move on to the Midwest, where Harris and Walz both hail from, the home state of Harris, Tim Walz. Joe Biden won Minnesota by 7 points in 2020, with 13% of early voters leaning toward the Democratic candidate. With almost 1 million votes cast and counted, Democrats now have a 23-point lead over Republicans. Since early in-person ballots have begun to replace the initial waves of mail-in votes, this lead has shrunk slightly. We still have Minnesota marked as a lean state for Harris and Walz on our election map. Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, the WIMPA states, will once again be pivotal in this race, and we can now zero in on them. From 1988 until 2016, these states voted in lockstep with the Democrats, but in 2016 they swung to Trump, giving him the 270 votes he needed to win. But in 2020, they all turned around and supported Biden again, paving the way for him to become president. Both candidates' chances of reaching 270 in the 2024 election are highly dependent on their performance in at least one of these states. If Trump were to win all 4 Sunbelt states like he did here, Kamala Harris may still get 270 electoral votes by sweeping the Rust Belt states. Thus, she could need all 3. Among the 3 states in the upper Midwest, Wisconsin is often considered to have the greatest Republican leanings, both in terms of population and political makeup. Because of its larger and more rural population, Wisconsin has leaned further to the right than Pennsylvania and Michigan in the last several election cycles, and its white working-class voters have been particularly receptive to Trump's message. Despite trailing Clinton by approximately 6.5 points and only winning by 0.7% in both 2016 and 2020, Trump significantly surpassed the final polling averages in this region. Also, Biden's lead shrank to the same 0.7% margin in 2020's final tally. According to the average of 538 polls, Harris is now leading by 0.7%. As in-person early voting has continued, the Democratic lead in the early voting process has been shrinking. The Democrats are now leading the Republicans by 11 points, with more than 1 million ballots cast. It would be interesting to observe if Republicans can achieve the same level of participation or perhaps higher than in 2020, when they were outnumbered by Democrats by 8 points in the roughly 2 million early votes. A notable early tendency, meanwhile, is the disproportionately low attendance among minorities compared to whites with college degrees. This might work in favor of Harris in the most populous of the key battleground states, Wisconsin. At this time, Wisconsin's position on the map is completely up in the air. On the other hand, I've been more bullish on Harris's prospects in Michigan than the whole picture suggests. In terms of basic bluesiness, Michigan stands out among the 3 WIMPA states. In 2020, Biden won it by nearly 3 points, and since then, Democrats have demonstrated good performance in contests that are closer to the ballot. With an exact 1% lead among key battlegrounds, Harris continues to dominate. According to the most recent 538 polling average, with nearly 2.5 million early votes in, Democrats now lead by 5 points, 47% to 42%, a notable decrease from the 14-point margin saw in our previous update. Nevertheless, among the 3.2 million early and mail-in ballots cast in 2020 for Biden's victory in Michigan, Republicans actually outnumbered Democrats by 2 points. These facts lead me to believe that Harris will be elected as the state's leaning Democrat. The only remaining battleground state, with 19 electoral votes, is Pennsylvania. According to Nate Silver's most recent prediction, which gives Pennsylvania a 34% chance of deciding the election. This highlights the importance of the state. The chances of Harris and Trump receiving 270 electoral votes go to about 90% if they are able to win this state. At this time, Trump is leading by a razor-thin 0.4% edge in the polls, and neither contender has held a lead of more than 1% since early September. The Keystone State is a true red-blue swing state. There have been 1.6 million ballots returned, according to early voting figures. Voters in Pennsylvania who would like to cast a ballot by mail must visit the county clerk's office to do so, as the state does not offer conventional early voting. It was anticipated that these votes would skew Democratic, and the current breakdown is 58% Democrats and 32% Republicans, for a margin of 26 points. On the other hand, the Democratic lead is far lower than it was in 2020, when it was 65% to 24% among 2.5 million ballots of this sort. In 2020, the lead was 31 points. Approximately 1 million votes were in the Democratic column 4 years ago. Nearly half of that is still there today. After all votes are cast and tallied, this pattern indicates that Republicans might end up with a higher overall return rate than Democrats. In light of this change, I'm updating the chart to show that Trump now has 287 electoral votes, since Pennsylvania is now tilting Republican. This leaves New Hampshire, Virginia, and Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, all of which trend more toward the Democratic Party as secondary battlegrounds. With 13 electoral votes cast and nearly 2 million ballots returned, the Democrats continue to hold a commanding lead of 50% to 39%, or a D+11 edge. Biden received a 10-point victory in Virginia in 2020, the biggest Democratic margin since FDR in 1944. Early voting accounted for over half of the total votes cast in 2020 and had an 8-point lean toward the Democrats. After taking into consideration the initial inflating of mail-in ballots, Democrats still have a good chance of winning. In Harris's likely blue column, I'll put Virginia. The Granite State follows. In 2016, Clinton barely edged out Trump by half a point in this state, but in 2020, the state went strongly for Biden, giving him a 7-point victory. Only around 60,000 ballots were cast in the early voting, with a slight 5-point advantage for the Democrats. Although the sample size is modest, the average of 538 polls reveals that Harris has a lead of more than 5 points over Trump. According to these signs, New Hampshire will remain a lean blue state. Finally, the statewide winner in Maine and the winner in Nebraska both receive 2 electoral votes, but each congressional district receives 1 vote from Maine. The 2nd district of Nebraska, which includes the Omaha metropolitan area, is racially diverse, mostly urban, and has a high percentage of college graduates. However, we do not yet have early vote data that is particular to this district. It leans farther to the left this time and voted for Biden by 6.5 points. At this time, I'm leaning toward Harris's likely blue district in Nebraska. With 287 electoral votes to Kamala Harris's 241 and 10 Wisconsin votes still up for grabs, Donald Trump appears to be well positioned to claim the presidency, according to an analysis of the early votes cast thus far. It looks like we're heading for a very close finish. As Election Day draws near, I will be providing additional updates, so be sure to subscribe to my channel below. But that's it for the video for today. In the description, I've included a shout-out to all of my channel members. Subscribing to my channel is below, and if you like the video, please hit the like button. As always, I am incredibly grateful for you viewing, and you can find more of my videos here on my channel. Until then, we'll meet again. EP Remove.